Thank you for bearing with us. My name is Denise Jansen. I teach at the School of Theology at Virginia Union University, and I chair the religious education in communities of faith and for REA. And I have the pleasure this morning of introducing Rita Nakashima Brock. Dr. Brock is Senior Vice President and Director of the Shea Moral Injury Center at Volunteers of America. She leads the organization's efforts to deepen understanding about moral injury in the many populations who experience it. A noted theologian, Dr. Brock was the founding director of the Soul Repair Center at Bright Divinity School, Texas Christian University, where she also was senior researcher of theology and culture. She's co-author of several books, among them Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War from Beacon Press, and Proverbs of Ashes, Violence, Redemptive Suffering, and The Search for What Saves Us, also from Beacon. She's a leading expert on moral injury and combat veterans, and offers trainings in mental health for mental health providers, professional chaplains, veterans, and families. Her academic pedigree reads like a list of who's who. She's been at Hamlin and Radcliffe and Harvard, and you name it, she's been there. And we are very privileged that she is with us today, despite the technical difficulties. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Rita. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Sorry that this is a little bit delayed. We're having a day of fronts coming through Minnesota, and something happened to the electricity for a bit. And I'm hoping it will come back. But in any case, my computer's fully charged, so I hope we get through this. I want to say that now I work for a nonprofit. I've worked for a nonprofit for 4 years doing direct services, and I was brought on board to create programs for moral injury across our populations that we serve. And we work with seniors, we work with veterans, we work with homeless populations, we work with people, citizens returning from prison. So we have quite a diverse population we serve. And because of the pandemic, we've actually wound up creating an online 1-hour program for processing moral distress that we open to the public. And so we have it 3 times a week, and it's a small group, peer facilitated process for helping people. And we started with healthcare workers during the pandemic, and it's expanded since then. I can give you the URL later if you're interested in it. But I got interested in moral injury 10 years ago, partly because I grew up in a military family. And when I heard the definition, I realized that had happened to my father in Vietnam. That was his last tour of duty. He did 2 tours at the end of his military career, which started with his first assignment at Normandy during World War II. So I had a personal interest in the research on moral injury in military veterans. But the deeper I got into the work, the more I realized that something extraordinary was happening in the mental health community, the people who do psychiatry and psychology around the work on moral injury. There's a book from 2016 that was written by people who did the original research on moral injury in military veterans, called Adaptive Disclosure, which was written for military and veterans. And one of the pieces of adaptive disclosure as a psychotherapy for people who might have moral injury was that they suggested the empty chair technique of having a person speak to someone they imagine to be a benevolent moral authority about their moral injury experience. And what I realized was that what they were talking about were spiritual care providers, chaplains, ministers, and people like that. And I thought, wow, so it would be interesting to talk about not imagining such people, but actually teaching such people about what moral injury is and how it might be processed. So it was sort of the first time I had a sense that the people who work in psychology and therapy were thinking about the kinds of people who go into ministry and chaplaincy as psychologically useful. So rather than harmful, I mean, it's a sort of attitude often about religion is that it harms people, which is also true. But since I'm a theologian who works on theologies of oppression, of liberation and anti-oppressive work, I thought, wow, this is a really interesting opportunity to be in conversation with the psychiatric therapeutic community. So that's how I sort of stepped into this work as a theologian. It seems kind of a strange field for someone trained in theology to wander into, but I've always had an interest in psychology, and in fact did object relations work for my doctoral thesis. So I'm not totally outside of an interest in psychology myself, since I think as a theologian, understanding psychology is really important. So that's just a background on how I stepped into this moral injury work, and have been working quite intensively with psychiatrists, especially Jonathan Shea, who originated the term in 1994 in his book Achilles in Vietnam, which was about the war in the Iliad from the perspective of military veterans and the meltdown that Achilles, the great warrior, has in that poetic epic. He saw that in the Vietnam era veterans he was working with. So he used that as a framework. And then in 2009, a group of clinical veterans, people who, led by Brett Litz, with a team including William Nash, who was a Navy psychiatrist for 30 years and now works for the Greater Los Angeles VA. They put together an essay that was a conceptual essay, an unusual conceptual essay rather than a research-based essay, based on their own clinical practice about something they were seeing that they did not think that ordinary psychotherapeutic practices for treating things like PTSD were able to address. And they got together to talk about what they were seeing in their own practice that emerged as a definition of moral injury, and this adaptive disclosure protocol they suggested might be helpful. And the way they defined moral injury was that it was a syndrome of self-handicapping that came from violating core, very deeply held core moral foundations, and the suffering caused by your moral conscience. And they defined that as what it meant to violate moral values meant that you violated by perpetrating acts, or by witnessing acts, or by failing to prevent acts that violate your conscience. And the research by Shira McGinn at San Francisco State, she had research on veterans who had killed in combat, and she was finding a double a suicide rate for them above the already high military veteran suicide rate. So the military suicide veteran rate was much greater than the civilian population. So it was 20 a day at that time. And she was finding among veterans who had killed in combat an even higher rate than that. So one of the acts that is deeply disturbing, even when it's morally may save lives, was mandated by your as legal by your government, and you were trained to do it properly, even that can be morally disturbing to people. But it also was about witnessing things or failing to prevent things. And then the third thing, or the other thing, the additional part of moral injury, which was Jonathan Shea's definition of it in 1994, which they folded in to the definition as one aspect of moral injury, is that it's the violation of something that's deeply right by someone in authority with power in a high-stakes situation. So his definition had three parts. And what that meant was that you were the victim of the perpetration of a moral failure. So the sort of prevailing definition people work with now and sort of fold those two together into the violation of what's right by the person themselves or by an authority in a very high-stakes situation where serious harm results. And that's the definition most people work with in various combinations. And I have a bibliography I can provide you with that involves some of the work by religion scholars who have been picking this up since Gabrielle Latini and I worked to form a moral injury unit in the American Academy of Religion. And so we've had Buddhist scholars, Muslim scholars, Hindu scholars, various scholars of other religions. Judaism just had a major moral injury conference at Hebrew Union about a month ago. So it's being picked up by religion scholars, and especially in first in sacred text, because Jonathan Shea worked with Homer, so it seemed obvious to look at the biblical texts and examine moral injury there. And so it's been studied in David and in Saul and Peter and Paul and various other religious texts from the Bible itself. So there's developing a rather rich religious literature around moral injury. And when I saw that definition in 2009, my first thought was, oh, well, every religion I've ever studied has some way to understand what it means to violate your core moral conscience, which in Christianity is called sin, mortal sin, really, the kind of sin that destroys your character. And I would say that if you suspect someone might have moral injury, the first thing you may notice is their personality or their character changes, because the kind of thing that is a moral injury is devastating to a person's relationship to the world. It's an identity crisis because as more and more research has been developing, both in human beings but also in mammals, that there is a kind of morality we're born with, we have no choice about. This is I'm going to make a theological claim that I am hearing the scientific, psychiatric, and psychology community also begin to make a claim for as a kind of ontological statement about human existence across the board, whatever culture, whatever religion, whatever tradition, whatever society that one belongs to, is that we are born moral because we're born as social animals that require other people to function, and love is as essential as food to us for that reason. And so our neurological and body systems are set up to want love, and that means we have to figure out how to behave in ways that we will be loved, and that's morality. And so that's a starting assumption that I now work with, even myself, in the way I think about human nature and human societies and oppression and liberation, is that we're all born moral. So when we do immoral things, it may be because of a life circumstance where we don't have a chance to make a moral choice. You will hear often Holocaust victims say, all the good people died. And that has to do often with things they had to do to survive that made them feel terrible as human beings. So it's really important to understand how deeply important morality is to human beings, so that even when you are a victim of terrible circumstances, you may all still feel like you violated your moral conscience in some way. And so there are terms that religious people use. As I said, sin in the Judeo-Christian traditions is commonly used for a violation of moral rightness, and God is sort of the symbol for that. So it's a violation of a relationship with God that separates you from the core life of your soul. There are also other religious terms for it. In Buddhism, it's dukkha in Sanskrit, which is translated into English as suffering, but suffering is not quite the right term for it because it has a moral content. It involves the recovery from that suffering involves a moral path with the word right occupation, right feeling right. It's like 8 Eightfold Path all has the word right. It's a moral term in it. And dukkha just means things out of joint. It's the pain that might happen if you dislocate your shoulder. It's for that empty space where the joint should be together and the intense pain that causes. So Buddhism has a way to talk about what it means to violate your conscience and be separated from your true self, your core no self. So there are a lot of religious terms for it, and the more I got into the work on moral injury, the more I realized that the religion space was really, really important for how to address it. And even for people who aren't religious, it's still a profound kind of suffering, and they can benefit from people who understand how to address it. So I've been running programs for Volunteers of America now for before the pandemic started. For 3 years, we were working with military veterans in an evidence-based program that we published in December of last year about that we found effective. And it takes 50 hours. It's called Resilience Strength Training, RST. And we've seen good results. So that we know that there are things that help. And I'm going to talk about some of that in a minute. But I want to say a little bit more about the kinds of things that happen when a person is morally injured, when they've done something to violate their conscience or experienced something that violated their conscience. And I'll begin with a simple story because it's in some sense it's both in a catastrophic context, but it's also a sort of thing that happened in a split second that changed a person's life. And the story is that I was being interviewed by a reporter for the Wall Street Journal around 2015-16, who was writing a freelance feature piece on moral injury and military veterans. And so he came to Fort Worth, Texas, where I had founded the Soul Repair Center to do work with religious communities about moral injury. And he interviewed me, and I explained the definition. I told him about some of the veterans I knew and how we'd worked, and some of the work we had been looking at that was around moral injury. And at that time, people were mostly struggling to define it, but there weren't any really established protocols except adaptive disclosure, which was not an established protocol, but a suggested one. And we got done with the interview and we were saying goodbye, and he looked at me, and this was a common experience I've had often nowadays. The way he looked shifted a bit, and he said, is it possible for non-veterans to have moral injury? And I said, absolutely. Why do you ask? And he said, I think I might have it. And so it was not a context for me to do much, but sort of just inquire as to how he thought he might have it. And he said he was working in the Twin Towers, where the Wall Street Journal offices were, when the planes hit the towers. And he said that he was in, I think, the first tower, and they didn't know what to do, and they were told to evacuate. And he said it took a half an hour or more to get down all those stairs from way above where the plane hit. His offices were above where the plane hit. And he said he got all the way to the ground floor with all the people who were struggling, and they worked really. And when he blew the door, the door was blown open, and it was smoke and clouds, it was chaos. He said he could hardly see, and everybody was running as fast as they could away from the buildings. And he said, so he started running. And as he was running, he saw an older man next to him fall. And he said, and he saw him fall out of the corner of his eyes, and he had the thought he should help him. He said, but I kept running. I didn't stop. And he said, so I looked back a little later, and I saw two people helping him get up. And he said, and to this day, I feel like I'm a horrible person that I didn't help him. And so I said to him, yeah, I think you might want to talk to somebody about it, like a good friend, because clearly it's making you feel terrible. It's still haunting you. And so that's a simple, it was just an instant in his life, in an extraordinary circumstance where serious harm was happening all around him, and he was trying to escape it. Sorry, I have my cat in the room with me today. And so it can happen like that in an instant, or it can happen because you're worn down from your life circumstances of poverty, or it can be an experience you had as a child because you were abused. And if you work in religious education, you probably know about the ACE scale for early childhood trauma and life prospects for people who have more than 2 or 3 of those traumas. Depending on the list, there are 10 or 11 of them, but they have to do with emotional abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, and other kinds of life circumstances that I think are actually circumstances around moral injury. And Judith Herman's extraordinary book from 1994, I think it was, Trauma and Recovery, is, I think, actually a book about moral injury, although she calls it complex PTSD because the term wasn't in common use at the time for moral injury. And there is a debate right now about whether moral injury belongs in the DSM as a disorder diagnosis. And a lot of even the clinical people I know that work on moral injury think it's not a disorder. It's a normal human response to extraordinary life conditions that make it easy to violate one's conscience or difficult to do what's right. And so I think it's really important to understand that moral injury, it isn't just the sort of twinges of conscience that we all have, and almost every religious tradition I know has some way to process those twinges. You can confess them to a priest, or you can make a sacrifice to a deity, or you can have a prayer of confession in a service. That these are all important ways to process the normal ways we mess up, the normal ways we have experiences of shame or guilt for things we've done. Moral injury is where that is not adequate, where it's just a deeper kind of sense of shame and guilt, remorse, regret, feeling unforgivable, feeling like you've become an evil person. There are all these profound ways in which you are in an identity crisis. And so it not only affects your self-perception, but it affects how you relate to the most significant relationships in your life. You may feel like you have become a contaminated force, or you may feel as if no one will love you if they knew what you had done or experienced, that you are somehow contaminated. And even if you are the victim of harm, like in the Jonathan Shea understanding of someone who had power over you, harmed you, even then you may feel tainted by evil. You may regret what you had to do to survive. So even when the person didn't deliberately cause harm, they may still experience themselves as outside the company of lovable people. So it affects your relationships. It affects your identity, as you may decide you're a bad person or unlovable. It will also impact your will to live. And it shatters your meaning system because, of course, if you feel that way, it means that the system you had for right and wrong that was guiding your life may no longer function for you. That you tried to be good and now you're a bad person. And so it'll affect your immune system. People often have their faith shattered when they have a morally injurious experience. There's a film about two veterans called Almost Sunrise, in which they walk from Wisconsin to Los Angeles, the Santa Monica Beach, to try to figure out why they're so miserable when they came home from combat. And I think it was from Iraq. But they just didn't feel right at home, and they couldn't relate to their family very well. And so they chose to do this walk once they learned about moral injury, and they were trying to figure out how to process it. And so they would stop along the way and talk to families that would put them up for the night, and sort of talk about it. And so one of them, Anthony, when they got to Santa Monica, felt a lot better, and he felt ready to go home to his family. So he did. But Tom, a second veteran, that was his friend, who was sort of there. Anthony was more extroverted and Tom was more introverted. Tom, he still didn't feel right. And so he wound up going to a fairly intensive yoga workshop. And it was interesting how the yoga released in him the misery he was feeling. And he realized that he was furious with God, even though he didn't think he was a religious person. He was furious with God for allowing his best friend to die next to him in a Humvee. And so he actually has a conversation with a priest, because his background was Catholic. He has a conversation with a priest to forgive God, to restore his relationship to God. And so for him, dealing with his moral injury required forgiving God, which is very interesting. For others, God no longer exists. They have to find a new meaning system because their life has lost goodness, meaning, and purpose. And so their own self-concept is profoundly affected by moral injury. And it's often the case that a person with moral injury not only is miserable inside, and they may hide it well, especially if they're high-functioning and able to use their intellect to sort of suppress the feelings of moral injury, that the authority over the self may be also compromised, so that they have difficulty calming down or having self-control. They may become more impulsive with outbursts of anger, or flat. They may be depressed, just flat, just don't want any feelings to surface because they're so intensely painful. Those are all signs that someone may be experiencing moral injury. And the fact is that moral injury is, because it's an affliction of conscience, if you try not to think about it, you might be able to delay the intensity of the feelings by suppressing them. So it has a unpredictable continuity over time. A person may seem maybe a little distant or remote, but functioning fine. And then it may erupt because something else happens to them that breaks everything open, or they just may age enough that their executive brain isn't able to suppress the moral injury any longer. So in the case of the Wall Street Journal reporter, he knew that instant. He knew when he saw the man being helped by someone else, and that he had that thought he should help him. He knew then that he had failed. And he had a response that tracked right back to that moment, and he felt terrible. He had felt terrible ever since. That I know an Air Force veteran who had moral injury for 4 years. And he said, for 40 years, I played a lot of golf and made a lot of money and didn't think about it. And when I was in the hospital, he was in his 70s, and he thought he was going to die. He was flooded with his profound moral injury that put him on a quest to figure out God and evil. He realized he had to go back to church. He hadn't paid much attention to his background in Christianity until then. And so he had a profound reaction 40 years later. So it's also not always clear when a person is going to experience moral injury. But I will say that as religious educators, as people who work in religion, all of us, we're going to be seeing I think, an enormous amount of moral injury in our societies right now in the aftermath of the pandemic, because there's so much tragedy and loss. It's a profound identity crisis, I think, the whole planet may be in different ways, in different occupations and in different family systems. But the level of helplessness of medical professionals, the level of just sheer death, the level of unresolved grief, because the normal, ordinary processes for dealing with death and failure and anger at incompetent governments, all of those things are major factors in moral injury, where you can't trust authorities to do the right thing, or the people in your life to do the right thing. You may feel ambiguous about trusting authorities because of that, and you may have lost people, or if you're a medical worker, you may be thinking of giving up on a career you spent most of your life committed to. So if this happened actually in Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries with the plague, that even the church couldn't stop the death. And so I think this is a timely moment to be thinking as religious professionals about what we can do to alleviate moral injury, which is why we started our 1-hour program for people to give them a way to process moral distress. We didn't think anybody right during the middle of a pandemic, or even now trying to recover from one, had 50 hours to give to a complete process of processing moral injury that we had developed for veterans. But we thought we knew some things from that program that would help us at least help people hang in there if they spent an hour processing some of the moral distress they were carrying. And we've developed a course also for moral injury for chaplains and spiritual care providers called Moral Injury Recovery in the Aftermath of COVID. And we have 2 more sections of the course we're going to offer on July 7th and 9th. If you're interested, you can email me, or you can go to www.voa.org/moral injury, and you will find the course for registration information. It's a day-long course, and we're giving credits for it, CEUs for it. But we realized that we needed to help people figure out how, in a short period of time at least, to be able to use some processes that we've developed with our veterans for addressing a moral distress. And the process we use that we have found most helpful, but it's something that chaplains can also do and spiritual care providers can also do, is that we use groups and we use peer specialists. We don't bring in people who are therapists or people who come into a relationship with clients in a transactional way. Rather, we try to use people who just want to help other people, that don't, they're getting paid for their time, but they're not mental health professionals. They're just caring people who want to help. And it's a way we think, because the moral injury is going to be an epidemic, we think, it's a way to help people process it without having to rely on insurance that's paid and the limited number of people who can provide that kind of care. Because I agree with the people who think that moral injury isn't a disorder, it's a life condition. And the way you recover from that life condition is you figure out why you're in an identity crisis and how you're going to rebuild that identity to restore yourself to caring relationships. And a peer specialist program in a group with other people who want to do that as well is the first step, we believe, in reestablishing those kind of relationships. And I think they're actually ideal for religious communities and spiritual care providers to do this kind of work, to bring people together again in community, making themselves vulnerable to each other, sharing their deepest hurts and harms, and providing that kind of lifelong friendship and support for addressing moral injury. And so that is the approach we use, but the kind of processes we use can also be used by spiritual care providers. And there are now a couple of books out on how to use sacred texts to raise the question in a community in a sermon or a talk around what moral injury is without making it sound like a therapy process. It's easy to use those stories to show how the trajectory of moral injury worked and what happens when you don't address it. For example, with the character of Saul in the Book of Kings. Brad Kelly's book, The Bible and Moral Injury, has a wonderful discussion of the character of Saul and his moral injury. The book Exploring Moral Injury in Sacred Texts has an essay by Rabbi David Blumenthal on the character of David in relation to the Bathsheba story and his moral injury, and how he recovered. And so Warren Carter has an essay on Judas and Peter. And so there, the biblical text, the Buddhist text, the Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, I think is an entire text on moral injury. This is a warrior asking a god about the meaning of life, even though he's a very successful warrior, he's trying to figure out the meaning of life. So there are wonderful religious texts, I think, in every religious tradition. And every religious tradition has rituals to help people address their conscience. And so I think this is a major resource we bring to the conversation around moral injury, is how we can adapt our own sacred traditions to help people come to terms with the devastations of death and moral failure. So, and there are, the wonderful thing about the use of religious traditions here is that there are multiple, we've discovered in working with veterans, that there are multiple ways that you can come at moral injury question with people to help them recover from it, with strategies that restore them. And so you can use, therapy can be helpful to people who are in an acute crisis if they are thinking of taking their own lives or so depressed they can't function. A therapy process can help put them back together enough to begin the recovery process. But therapy, and all the clinicians and psychiatrists I know that work on this say therapy isn't enough. What is required is reestablishing relationships and a new life and a new meaning system. You have to actually come to terms with your meaning system to be able to function. Zachary Moon, who's a professor of practical theology, pastoral theology at Chicago Theological Seminary, was a counselor in seminary with the VA, and then he became a Navy Reserve chaplain who deployed with the Marine Corps at Camp Pendleton, and then did his doctorate on moral injury at Iliff Theological Seminary. He talks about the moral injury as a break in your moral orienting system. So if you're going to come back from moral injury, recover from moral injury, you have to find a new moral orienting system. And it may be a repair of your old system, but your old system as it was isn't going to be adequate because it broke. So the moral injury process can actually give you a stronger moral basis for living into the future because it's more adequate for taking in the suffering you experienced. And that is something that an entire community may need to do because their moral meaning system didn't get them through the pandemic in an adequate way, or too many people in the community have their system break down and they need to find a new way to live into the future. And so what we found is that when you do this with small groups, when you do this in community with people who experience maybe not the same things that cause their moral injury, but what Bill Nash, a psychiatrist who's one of my best informants on the research on moral injury, what he says is the military culture has different kinds of moral injury. Poverty produces other kinds of moral injury. There's lots of forms of moral failure, and what counts as a moral failure can vary from society to society because every society has different moral orienting systems. And so what causes moral injury in one person may not in another because of their moral orienting systems, but the feelings behind moral injury of guilt and shame and remorse, sorrow, intense grief, anger, fury, all of those feelings, he said, are the same. This is the human condition. And so when you put people with moral injury together, they may not have the same experiences, but they can empathize. And what that process does is restore their lost sense of empathy for others, because they've also lost a sense of empathy for themselves. And so being asked to empathize with others also gives them empathy for themselves, or compassion for others gives them compassion for themselves, which they may have lost because they're angry at God or themselves or other people. And so we found that working with small groups is more effective because it starts to reestablish significant relationships for people that they can trust, because these are people who have experienced moral failure and aren't going to judge their moral failure. And we use peer specialists to facilitate these groups. We train them on group sort of intercultural, interreligious group facilitation, and have them co-facilitate our small groups so that they participate as peer specialists in the group. They're not above the group diagnosing, evaluating, offering advice, or any of those things. They're there to just help other people like themselves with a few skills that they've learned to make that process work. But they participate, and they also share their own stories to create a sense of trust in the group. And that low bar for trust is absolutely essential for people being able to unload the kind of moral injuries they need to unload in order to recover. And I will say that we've had plenty of veterans. We pushed 100 veterans through our research-based protocol and program, and quite a number of them were either referred by their VA therapist to the program because the therapist had seen it work for someone else, or they were seeing a therapist and just decided they needed something else, and they tried this. And others who wouldn't see a therapist, just wouldn't do it, and went through our program. And some of them actually decided after the program that maybe they needed to see a VA therapist. But what many of them said, who were in therapy or seeing a therapist or were referred by a therapist, said, I said things I would never have told my therapist. I said them to my group. And I think that's because they knew they wouldn't be judged or evaluated, that they could just share the level of pain, the deepest pain they were experiencing, the experiences that they often couldn't even verbalize, because we have different techniques we use for helping them find their way into the suffering they were carrying with moral injury. So the group process establishes a low bar of trust because it eliminates some of the fear of judgment, and it creates a context for mutual vulnerability that helps people recover their sense of compassion and empathy for others, and therefore for themselves. It allows them to use their negative experiences in a positive way for others. Like their sharing actually connects them to other people, and so they can begin to think about their experiences and process them instead of running from them as something that's going to make them completely break down. And that process of getting a hold of their story, getting a hold of their moral injuries, and actually talking about them gives them a sense of agency and responsibility, even if it's the kind of moral injury where they've been victimized by somebody else. Taking responsibility and agency in that context helps them help themselves and others, and it helps them rebuild a meaning system by using that sense of agency and responsibility. The reason we use the group peer specialist process is it's easy to scale. You can, most of our In fact, beyond the first facilitators we used for groups that had not gone through a group because we hadn't had the groups, we trained them through role playing and training, how you train people to facilitate groups. But after the first set of early facilitators, all of our facilitators came from people who went through the experience and wanted to help others by becoming facilitators. And so those facilitators that went through our 50-hour experience were the core group that helped us establish the pandemic 1-hour online program by becoming facilitators in that program. And they still work in that program as volunteers. And they also work as trainers of facilitators who go through and want to become facilitators. And we set up that program now in a separate line for AARP, the Association of Retired Persons, because their Fraud Watch program was getting 300 to 400 calls a day of older adults being victimized by fraud. And so we created a program for them to help them process their feelings of humiliation and just awful feelings from being victimized by fraud. And we're also working with a healthcare company to establish a similar peer support process for nurses in their first year of practice. They're called graduate nurses, and they have a 50% dropout rate from those classes because the first year of nursing is so hard. And during the pandemic, it's been really hard. So we have a process for helping them cope with the kind of tragedies and difficulties that they're seeing in their first year of nursing and the sense of failure and incompetence they often have because it's too much. So it's easier to scale when you're actually the program itself creating the leadership that wants to continue the program. And so you can multiply the number of facilitators that if you need them, you can get them trained relatively quickly. So we use that kind of process. And I think it's ideal for use in religious communities because, of course, we know that in religious communities, the priest, the imam, the minister, the rabbi is only one person who has particular education for interpreting texts and things like that. But they always need a team of spiritual caregivers in their communities and who work with smaller populations, even subgroups within their communities. And so utilizing the kind of good spiritual leadership in a religious community to train them to how to help members of the community process their moral injury is a natural thing a religious community could do because they're sort of set up that way. And so I want to clock through because I don't want to spend all the time talking. I want to have time for people to interact. We clock. There are a lot of strategies we use in the groups, and one of the key ones we use is writing and art. Those are the two things that we found most helpful for people to externalize their moral injuries. And we use certain timed writing exercises where they can't stop writing, so their editor can't filter out what they're writing, and they're often surprised by what they write. And we use those before they share. And that gives them a chance to control how much they share, how much they make themselves vulnerable, so they're not overexposed and then embarrassed. We also use art. We've had our veterans, and this is something it's easy to do with these mask templates that are paper. We have them make a mask of their military face. And sometimes that they wind up making a face that is stuff they forgot about or stuff that they weren't able to put into words. If they have traumatic brain injury or other things that impede their capacity to use language, sometimes the visual will actually reveal things that then they can talk about it because it's a different part of your brain that stores visual memory. So we use art like that. You can use collage in groups. People who use art therapy know this. We also use art. We use music and rhythm and body activities that are rhythmic to help people when they're in deep emotion processing that's very painful. Having them just do a simple drumming exercise or sharing music or singing can lift their spirit, can help them keep going with the difficult emotional work. we use that. We also use spiritual practices. We begin and end every session with mindful breathing because it helps people access trauma without their emotions being quite so stirred up. And we even teach our facilitators to use breathing moments when somebody is especially stirred up and the whole group is stirred up emotionally by sharing. We actually have just a long silence with breathing, which helps people take it in and really listen. And we use a process called deep listening, which is not a conversation, but a process of each person sharing the moral distress that they are in, and people just listening empathetically. But that kind of deep listening creates a space in a group for the person to put their pain in the middle and for it to be shared. And so we go from person to person with each person sharing and everybody else listening until they're done. And then after everyone has had a chance to speak that way, then we ask them to reflect on how it felt, what they learned about themselves and others. So we have a time for reflection, but we found that people need to unload their story. They need to unload the pain that they are in without interrogation, without evaluation, without chit-chat or people trying to deflect because they're uncomfortable with the feelings. And so we just let people share and then have silence, and we found that very effective. And the writing and the art help people sort of decide how much emotional exposure they want to have. And we often find the first few people that speak want to say something later on because they realize they didn't share as deeply as some of the others and they want to share more. And so we found the group process is useful. It also often establishes permanent friendships. We have that happen from our groups. But it lets people just be themselves without being worried about being judged. And we use lots of writing and artwork for that process in our programs. For the 1 hour online, we just use a guided meditation. And then we ask them to share after they do a guided meditation, because there isn't really a lot of time to do the writing. But in a religious context, you could use all kinds of things. And one of the practices we found really useful in a modified way for what we do is a Buddhist therapeutic practice that Chizuko Ozawa da Silva wrote a book about, which is a kind of Buddhist psychotherapeutic practice of dealing with your earliest, most difficult relationships by writing. And I mean writing for 100 hours, not, at 5 minutes. People write for an entire day for about the first 5 years of their life, and then an entire day about the second 5 years. And we don't do that, but we use the same kind of questions to help them get in touch with the earliest experiences of their lives when they realized they were loved. And the person who loved them may have also harmed them, but it helps us put a pin in a life trajectory that starts before their moral injury, because moral injury sort of takes up all this emotional space in their lives, and they can't even remember being loved, or they can't even remember that this person that harmed them also loved them. And that ambiguity, but that sense of being a person who was once loved, it gives them a platform from which to examine their moral injury trauma without the trauma being all of what they are. So we use processes like that. We also use rhythmic drumming practices that help people align their breathing and heart rate together. There's something about how when our bodies are aligned, we feel more part of a group. And we also, after they've shared their moral injury experiences and traumas, we then ask them to start thinking about their value systems and what might help them live into the future with a sense of respect for others and love for them and themselves. And I think that's, and then the final thing I would say, and this is the last thing I'm going to say about recovery strategies, is ritual, which is what religious and spiritual communities do. Ritual is profoundly important for processing moral injury because it creates a container for emotions. It creates a container for that process of telling painful things and experiencing grief and all these complex emotions. It actually creates a pattern for getting someone through a process to a conclusion, some kind of resolution of those feelings that can hold those feelings without them destroying the person. And that beginning and a middle and end is a kind of narrative structure, and texts with narrative structures can be used for that process. But rituals take place outside of ordinary time. They're not part of ordinary life, and yet they impact ordinary life in very powerful ways. So I know, for example, a church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that has a ritual for returning people who leave their military careers and become veterans, where they actually have the person come in their military uniform and they read their military record, and people give honor to the person for being willing to serve their country, and for taking on the burden of moral injury and the work of defending the Constitution and all those sorts of things, and as a thank you to them. And then the person leaves and comes back in civilian clothing, and they all gather and lay hands on that person and welcome them back in their community. And it's a powerful ritual way of honoring that transition from military to civilian life, in the same way that every society has these rituals for honoring life transitions. So, and I think it would be a powerful impact if religious communities, as they begin to open up, create a ritual process from COVID to post-COVID life, that honors all the terrible things that people have gone through during COVID, and just says, yeah, it's really bad what happened. And then to honor the pain of all of that, and then get people to a point of looking forward into a future where they can be together again. So these ritual processes can actually help an entire community begin to process moral injuries and difficulties and struggles they've had, if they've experienced them in a kind of way that, like we all did with COVID. But music and movement and quiet time to reflect, these are all parts of most rituals, and they're important for helping people discover that they do have meaning and value for other people, which is really what a meaning system is for, and to construct a meaning system, a moral meaning system that can see them into a future that can integrate the past rather than deny it or try to walk away from it or pretend it didn't happen. That's just denial, and that's part of moral injury. So as my friend Tyler Boudreau's a military veteran says, when somebody's telling you a really harrowing, difficult story and they tell it to you the same way every time, that means they're hiding behind it. They're not processing. Because if they're processing, they're changed by the processing, and the story starts to shift. So the telling of the story also starts to shift, which may in fact be why in the Bible we have so many different versions of the same story sometimes, because people are processing it. So I'm going to stop there and just say that it's important to remember that the recovery process from moral injury is not simple, and it's because it's an identity crisis, and rebuilding a new identity isn't simple. And people will have setbacks and struggle with things sometimes, because it's not a straight line, a trajectory of recovery. It's more like a labyrinth walk where you see things in a new way, but you're processing, and it just takes a long time, and things change, life things hit you, and so it's a kind of processing that may be lifelong. And I'm going to stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Brock, for all that you shared. And I'm going to invite us to thank Dr. Brock with a round of applause. Seeing lots of comments in the chat, and I've tried to keep up with them because once they're out of view, a couple of questions I'm going to raise for people, and then I want to invite folks who might be interested in asking a question to grab the mic. So I'm going to try to pull some of the questions out of the chat.
Okay.
The the one simple question is, could you say the name of that Buddhist therapeutic practice one more time?
Oh, yes. Naikan. It's Naikan. Naikan. If you Google Naikan, you'll find articles now online. Lots of people in Buddhism are talking about it. And I learned about it from Chizuko Ozawa de Silva's life partner, Brendan, who gave a paper at the American Academy of Religion about a woman who was in prison for murdering her own mother, who came to terms with what her mother had done to her, because she had murdered her mother for pimping her out to her drug dealer. Not her, but her younger brother. I mean, she was pimped out until she went to college, and then her mother started doing with the younger brother. She killed her mother and tried to kill the drug dealer and failed. So that to me persuaded me it must work. I just, because she, her last line in her journal was, "The cup of poison I've been drinking from my whole life is empty. I don't need it anymore." And she was in for life, so she was going to commit her life to help other people who were going through what she was going through. So that is a major life transformation of identity. And so we use bits of it. We don't do the whole process, but what I think is really important for helping people process an identity crisis as deep as moral injury is to give them a point in their life where they remember being loved. Because that is what is the agency and responsibility they can use. I was once loved, to get through all the horrors. We had a woman in one of our very first groups who had been sexually molested by multiple people in her family, had a mother she believed didn't love her. And the military for her was a stability. It was like regular meals and a life that was reliable. But then she experienced military sexual trauma in the military, and then was on drugs and spent time in like a decade in prison, lost custody of her son, spent a decade in prison for drug charge. I mean, she had every possible trauma you could possibly imagine for a woman. And when she came to our program for veterans, she was living in one of our low-income housing programs for veterans with children because she'd had another son who was about 10, I think. And she was struggling. And so she went through a week, and I, because it's peer facilitated, I don't know what they do in the groups. We just know it works and we do have a 100-page manual that they clock through with scripts for doing everything. But they wanted to have a fire the last night to burn things they wanted to get rid of. And we hadn't built that into the program, but we thought, well, that's a good request. So we went to the retreat center and asked where they were staying and asked them, could they do that? And they figured out a way with a barbecue pit to have us have a fire that night. And she read, and they invited us who were not in the group, but were in staff support positions. And we always have a clinician backup, always, for peer specialist programs. And so the clinician and I and another program administrator, we went, they invited us. So we went, and this woman, we didn't know that much about her. She said, all of my life, I have lived with pain, and I did not feel like myself if I wasn't living in pain. And she said, so I was sexually molested. My mother didn't love me. I was in prison, and I lost custody. And she clocked through all of it, and she said, I don't need, so I am burning my pain. And a year later, the son she had lost custody of was living with her, and this 10-year-old son, who's now like almost 12, came to a reunion event. And the older son pulled me aside and he said, I know this program's for veterans, but I want you to know it's for families too, because I think it saved our family. Because my mom, when she came home from your thing, she wasn't mean to us anymore, and she actually listened to us, and we have real conversations with her, and we're really happy together now. So it was really an amazing that somehow she figured out that she could love her children because she had experienced some kind of love at some point in her life, and that she didn't have to hang around with the pain. She didn't have to inflict that pain on others because she didn't inflict it on herself anymore.
Right.
So those kinds of things are I just find them magical. I mean, and it isn't that they don't have difficulty when they leave our program, but they never go back to baseline. That was the thing we learned from the research data, is that of course they have the immediate high a week after they started the program, and they've released so much stuff and come to more self-realization and connected to people who actually respect and like them, which may be an experience for some of them. But then even 6 months later, which everybody said that's too long, we should do it 2 months later, but we went with 6 months. That 6 months later, they actually kept improving on some things, and some things went down, but they never went back to baseline. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say anything you can do as an intervention with moral injury will help. Even an hour online with people will help. Because doing something is always better than doing nothing. And it doesn't take a professional. It doesn't take a person who's trained in psychotherapy to help someone with moral injury. It can just be someone who's a friend that just says, "How you doing?" But if you genuinely want to know, you have to be prepared for, and this is what you have to prepare facilitators with, is you may hear things that are deeply disturbing, and you have to learn to listen neutrally and caringly instead of responding with disgust or horror, because you never know what it's going to be. Right. So you do have to, as facilitators, we work with them on that. And we find the mindfulness breathing itself is just very useful for preparing people to listen without being overly emotionally reactive.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's so helpful. What you're describing is just so fascinating. And there's just so many connections that are being made in the chat. Connected it to purity culture and the trauma of emerging from, and another person who talked about indigenous peoples who are who are in lots of ways, but who are connected through BIA to people who are kin, who are now policing them.
Yes.
In the ways that breaks relationship, prison violence, COVID, it just goes on.
On and on. And what's interesting is that a person I met through a humanities program is working on a doctorate at Duke in anthropology, who was U.S. Army in Iraq. And he's from Appalachia, so he's from a Christian background and all that, but he didn't find his childhood religious tradition helpful to him at all. And so he was being treated for PTSD by the VA. And he did have it, but he wasn't feeling right. And so he tried a Native American sweat lodge process. Mm-hmm. And some VA centers now have Native healers who are willing to have non-Native veterans participate in their rituals. And he found it incredibly helpful. So his dissertation is an anthropological study of non-Native veterans who use Native American ceremonies. So that's where that's another case where, this ritual is about, I've gone through sweats. You're naked. At least the one I went through, you had a towel, but you're pretty much naked. And it's hot and it's dark and it's close quarters, so bodies are touching. And you just pray. You sing and pray, and people pray their hearts out. And it's like, wow! So it's a deeply embodied purification process that I found amazing. I can see why it's really effective. But Chester Nez is in his memoir. He was a Navajo code talker in World War II. Talks about the enemy way ceremony in the Navajo tradition, basically saving his life. But 6 months after he came back from the Pacific War as a code talker, he told his family, he's a sheep herding family in northern New Mexico, and he was out herding sheep for 6 months. And he told his family he was going to kill himself because the Japanese ghost wouldn't leave him alone. And so he did an enemy way, saved his life.
Wow.
Yeah. So these rituals can be quite powerful and important for sustaining people. And I agree. I think in terms of Native Americans being betrayed by their own people policing them, I think a lot of us experience a sense of betrayal by our own government. for putting so many people at risk for death that we didn't have to have the death rates we had if they'd not dismantled the entire pandemic response system, hadn't pulled people out of China where they could have gotten early warnings. So there's a certain level of, I think, fury about what happened during the pandemic, as well as the loss. I lost a cousin I was very close to in February, not because of COVID, but because of cancer, but I couldn't go to a funeral. It was just devastating not to see her children, to see her family that I love so much. I'm finally going to see them at the end of July. I'm just so looking forward to that. But so there's a suspended profound grief, I think. And you have the doctor in last April who killed herself in New York, highly successful ER doctor, very high functioning, optimistic, good family, no reason to be a suicide, who wound up, had a supervisor in one of the worst affected ERs in the country. And she actually went sort of catatonically and was actually hospitalized for a week. Right. Which probably spelled the end of her career. Doctors who have mental health diagnoses often can't get liability insurance.
Right.
So there, so there were these losses, so many losses. At least this is a sort of kind of grief process, and I do think it would be a really interesting experiment, as it were, or I just think it would be valuable for religious communities to think about. When you come back, to have a ritual of actually, I thought maybe you should have everybody come in wearing a mask to signal the before that they're trying to now move from, and then having a ceremony where people could take their mask off in a collective way and maybe write on them the things they're willing to let go of now in a mask, or do something with bury the mask, put them on a wall. There are ways, because I think ritual processing really does help put a beginning, middle, and end to a process. And that end is really important. How you end it, what you're looking into the future with, that doesn't deny, because a ritual doesn't deny what happened. It just says, man, this was so bad, let's deal with it. And that gives also people a sense of better agency about their ability to cope with it when they leave the ritual. Also. Right. So when I saw that the original essay on moral injury, and they did a little description of adaptive disclosure and having a conversation with the spiritual, I thought, oh, that's just imaginary. I know the real stuff. Let's get with the real stuff. We have people that know how to do that kind of thing, and their religious communities are also quite abusive, and don't work for people because they're too narrowly constricted. Or as Kent Drescher, who's a Presbyterian minister and a VA clinician in Palo Alto, he's a psychologist and a minister, says if they have a really judgmental, punitive understanding of their higher power, it just makes their moral injury worse. Right. So you have to help guide people beyond that kind of theology. And purity culture is very much grounded in that kind of narrowly constricted idea of sacred power. Right. That's what makes you good, what defines you as a good person.
Mm-hmm. Something you said is really interesting. The way in which the end of something is really important, and COVID feels like it doesn't have an end.
Yeah. And it may not. I mean,
right.
Flu doesn't have an end. I mean, it's interesting. A while back for the book Saving Paradise I wrote, I did a lot of research on that period of the plague in Europe in the 14th century and how it broke the back of the Catholic Church because priests ran away from their duties. They were terrified, and they died of the plague. And there's this quote from Ralph of Shrewsbury in England where he's saying, well, if a priest can't be found to do the last rites for the dying, a layman can do them, and if a layman can't, like these are people that can't be found, if a layman can't be found, even a woman could do the priest's rites, right? So the authority structure of the male priesthood in the Catholic Church, you can see it breaking down in the plague. And so what did that do? That opened the doors for the Protestant Reformation, for humanism, for all of the things that came out of Western Europe science, because the massive religious structure that was medieval Europe broke down. And so I'm sort of curious, coming out of COVID, what we're going to experience. But we have the benefit of history of knowing that stuff does break down. So how can we make interventions that don't lead to complete collapse of institutions that may be quite valuable? And I actually think religious and spiritual institutions, especially around moral injury, have enormous value, but not if they just try to reassert their old authority and go back and say, we can just now move on. No, you have to integrate this. You have to, I think that's what it means just to move forward, is to integrate what happened in a way that doesn't either drive your agenda forward because of the trauma or hamper in some way truth-telling and moving forward in a way that's honest.
Yeah, the dissonance of being in a place that tries to reassert authority it no longer has.
Yeah. And the Catholic Church, actually, at the Council of Trent, they actually had to revise themselves because so many people wandered away from Catholicism into other things. In that several hundred. And the other thing that happened, which we may also see, is that peasants became really valuable because there were not enough of them to work the fields, and so their lives actually improved because they could make demands. Right. So we may begin to see the underpaid workforce also something happening there, but it could be really bad instead of good.
Right.
Companies that figure out, they're disposable, we don't need them.
Interesting. Yeah. The waste will emerge.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to remind folks that you can grab the mic if you'd like to ask a question live. And I also want to acknowledge a couple of things in the chat. One of them is someone asking if they could have access to the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
We'll find a way to do that.
I'll make it available. I have to take all the images out because I have images that are really large in the PowerPoint, and so that doesn't translate well into being shared. But yeah, I can create a PDF.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. Another person asks, and I'm going to try to get this right. They're asking if either natural hallucinogenics or synthetic drugs are useful in this process.
There appears to be some value, especially for, and I never say it right, the magic mushrooms.
Right.
Psilocybin or something like that. I have a friend who was a battalion surgeon in Vietnam who is a retired sports medicine doctor, and he swears that some of those hallucinogens are actually better than the drugs they use for depression, which are just deadening and awful for people and have lots of side effects. And of course, we know there are lots of traditions of the Native Americans use peyote. I mean, there have been traditions that understood that drugs sometimes were helpful. And so Native Americans didn't smoke, but they used tobacco. Right? In there.
Right.
I think a lot of the modern drugs are just extracts or derivatives or chemical compounds that can also be found in other places like drugs. So yeah, I certainly the loosening up on marijuana is part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
a lot of veterans use it. I had a friend who was a veteran in Texas who works for a mental health organization as a kind of peer specialist, intervention specialist, and he said he got addicted to heroin in Vietnam, and he managed somehow to bring home a lot of really good heroin when he came home, and then he spent a fair amount of time addicted to heroin, and it got him through somehow. He's not addicted anymore, but and he doesn't recommend it, but I think it kept him alive.
Gotcha. Right.
Yeah.
Well, we could this could be a whole conference, as I'm sure you have participated in previously, but we are so grateful for you sharing with us today.
I will say that lots of religious rituals use chemicals, alcohol, peyote.
Sure.
So it's not unheard of for rituals to, and it's a way ever actually people can use them and not that you can watch them. So if they're not having a good trip, you can help them. Right. Instead of making people do this alone and ashamed as an illegal activity.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the richness of all you shared. You can see the applause is finding its way to the top. You're hearing lots of thank yous in the chat. We are so grateful for your presence with us today and for all that you've shared.
Yeah, and the PowerPoint of the PDF will also have a bibliography because I mentioned
perfect.
Yes, it's a good bibliography I can share.
Excellent. Thank you so much.